Chondral ossification, we have intramembranous ossification to do. So this is page 22, Roman numeral 6, letter A, item 2, endochondral ossification. All right. No, we did endochondral. We need to do intramembranous. So if you recall, and all you have to do is look at your notes, so you don't need to write it all down again, but you've got the cells of the embryo versus the cells that will form the placenta. And the embryonic cells differentiate the cells that will form connective tissue versus epithelial tissue versus nervous tissue, muscle tissue. And then within the connective tissue group, well, there are lots of subcategories there, but the two of interest to us were the hyaline cartilage, and that takes us the endochondral pathway to bone. Versus the fibrous connective tissue, which takes us to bone via the intramembranous pathway. So, in other words, making bone within, within, not inter or extra, but making bone within a membrane. So I want you to picture the skull as a membrane, okay? It's very soft, very pliable, it's not bony, it's not cartilage. And within that membrane, you get ossification centers corresponding to the bones. So you're going to get ossification centers here and here for the parietal bones, for the temporal bones, for the frontal bones. You only have one frontal bone, but you used to have two. The way we will visualize this initially is we'll do it like they do with a globe. Okay, you've all seen a globe in a science class. You've also seen a globe in a picture where they unfold the globe. Okay, so take a spherical object and unfold it, and you lay it out flat. So this is superior skull, anterior, posterior, and this is just a membrane. So you would get ossification centers corresponding to, I should have used letters, the two frontal bones, the two parietal bones, the two temporal bones, and the occipital bone. In that membrane, those ossification centers begin as a single cell. What type of cell is that? An osteoblast. An osteoblast. So calcium is laid down in that area. So at this point, the part that is red, I mean, you could fill it in if you wanted to. The part that is red is bone. The rest of it is a fibrous membrane. So calcium is literally moving from the blood into the membrane via the osteoblast. They're being stimulated hormonally as we've already discussed, the whole homeostasis part. Ossification continues. So now we have a little more bone. We still have primarily membrane, but we have a little more bone. Ossification continues. Now we've got a fair amount of bone, but we still have a lot of membrane there. This point right here is the quote-unquote, the layperson's word, soft spot in the baby's head. A lot of you probably had a little baby brother or sister, maybe it was a little cousin, and mom, dad, aunt, Gretchen, whatever. Can I hold the baby? Yeah, sure, hold the baby. Now be careful. Don't poke the baby in the soft spot. And when nobody's looking, you're like, yeah! I wonder what happened to my sister. Oh, God. Actually, she's dead. God rest her soul. But it's a story for another day. Anyway, you've got a lot of soft spots in there, and at birth you have more membrane than bone. Of course, that's because the head is going to be compressed, and they're often born looking like little cone heads or something because they had to make their way through the birth canal, and they generally refold and come out pretty much normal like we are. So we will move now to a picture of a fetal skull. These are in the lab. Half of you played with them on Monday, the rest of you will play with them today. So that's the soft spot, and the technical name for it is the anterior fontanelle. So quite literally, ossification for the two frontal bones started in those two areas. And the ossification simply spread. The bone is overtaking the membrane. The name of the soft spot there, I think I just said it, but honestly, I'm so old I can't even remember what I said 5 seconds ago. It's the anterior fontanelle. Yeah, the remembering thing is kind of weird. I almost worry about myself. My son borrowed my 4Runner to go camping over the weekend, and he brought it back, and the inside was so clean. And I thanked him. I said, "You must have cleaned the interior." And he said, "Yeah, I was embarrassed for my friends to get in it." I said, "Well, thanks." And then like 2 days later, I noticed the inside was clean, and I said, "Oh, I need to tell Lawrence that." I said, "Hey, Lawrence, you must have." He said, "Dad, you told me that." "Are you serious? Did I really?" "Yeah, Dad. Do you really not remember?" "I'm not joking, man. I don't." And then this morning, I got in the 4Runner, and I'm like, "God, I hadn't seen it this clean in a long time. I need to remember to tell Lawrence." And I said, "Wait a minute. I think I've already told him twice." So at least I had God, man, that's bad. And I can remember the serial number on my crib. All right, if we start rotating things, we'll see that there are, if we include right and left anyway, there are 6 main fontanelles. So now we're looking at the back of the skull. That's the posterior fontanelle. So think about what bones the different fontanelles are in between, as well as what sutures they are associated with. So the posterior fontanelle is between the occipital and the 2 parietals. The anterior fontanelle is between the 2 parietals and the 2 frontals. What suture runs from the anterior fontanelle all the way to the posterior fontanelle?
Sagittal.
Sagittal suture, okay. And then what suture runs perpendicular to the sagittal suture and right through the posterior fontanelle? Lambdoidal suture, okay. All right, if we go to the side, because as I said, there are 6. So this shows us the anterior and posterior lateral fontanelles. This is the anterior lateral and the posterior lateral. And you can write those, say those, spell those 2 different ways. You can call this the anterior lateral fontanelle, so 3 words. Or you can combine the words anterior and lateral with the connecting vowel O. That's the way medical terminology works. So this is also the anteriolateral fontanelle. 2 words instead of 3. Anterior lateral fontanelle. Again, if you think about your bones and your sutures, so what suture runs from the right anterior lateral fontanelle across the skull to the left anterior lateral fontanelle? Frontal or coronal suture, exactly. Okay. All right, next page. Page 23 called Special Topics. There's nothing terribly special about the special topics. I just felt the need to give the category a name. The thing in common with everything in Roman numeral 7, I suppose you could say that these are things that over the last nearly 3 decades I've expected students to know, assumed they would know, given a bone chart, given a lab filled with bones, given a lab manual and a textbook filled with pictures. I assumed they'd know this stuff. And I guess somebody said, I didn't know I'd have to know that. So I wrote it down. Note to self, be sure and point out blah, 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 blah. And so the list has evolved since 1988 when I started at college. So, letter A, sutures and fontanelles. Yes, you need to know the sutures and fontanelles. Now, we just looked at the fontanelles, so we won't look at them again. That just seems stupid at this point. But as far as the sutures go, you've got the, what's this one called? Squamous. Squamous has another name, doesn't it? Temporal. And this one? Oh, you're cheating. I'm kidding. I know you weren't looking at that. You wouldn't feel right if you did. What's this one? Frontal, coronal, and then of course you have the sagittal. So yeah, you need to know the sutures and the fontanelles. Letters B and C, skull and face. There's a couple of things going on here, and they're actually huge. First of all, skull versus face. I guess one thing we could do, and I intended to have the bone chart up. So you get your bone chart out, and I'll get mine out while you get yours out. So skull versus face, the first thing we could do is take a look at the bone chart and see what it has to say about that. Which I know we've already done, I just don't know if you remember it. So in axial, we start out over there on the left with cranial bones, that corresponds to skull. Then we shift to facial bones. So the simplest example of why do I have here in your lecture notes letters B and C, skull versus face? Well, are the parietal bones skull bones or facial bones? On the zygomatic bones, skull bones, or facial bones. So that's part of why that's there. And again, these are just topics that over the years, you know, a student perhaps said after an exam, I didn't know I'd have to know that. And so I wrote it down, you know, maybe on my hand, whatever. Note to self, remind students that, yeah, they need to know this. And then so this little list has just evolved. The other thing, though, and I said this is huge, the other thing that goes into having those words written down, skull and face, is the following. I honestly expect that you can close your eyes and picture all of these pictures. Okay? All of them. Because that's what anatomy is, the structure. And we'll get into lots and lots of specific examples, especially if we're talking about the eyeball sockets or the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and some of those are actually on this list. But I always start with the following example, and you've got the picture in front of you, but you know, just realize that you'll be expected to respond to these types of questions without a picture. Just, you know, close your eyes and see it. So if you're looking at the floor of the cranial vault, I'm asking about a midline structure that is just posterior to the frontal bone. Crista galli. Yeah, crista galli. Floor of the cranial vault, that's what this is. Midline structure, something that's just posterior to the frontal bone, crista galli. And what part of what bone is just posterior to that? Crista galli is part of the ethmoid bone. What part of the ethmoid, what part of what bone is just posterior to the crista galli of the ethmoid bone? Okay, body of the sphenoid. Sella turcica, the sphenoid would be another good answer. Okay, so can you respond to questions like that without pictures? Okay. So I'm telling you, I expect you to be able to do that. Okay, so if you need to, you know, throw a few extra hours in, well, fine, you've got plenty of time to do it. Name the foramen that is posterior and lateral to the foramen ovale.
Foramen spinosum.
Exactly. Foramen spinosum. Here's ovale, posterior and lateral to that. So this is posterior, that's lateral. So posterior and lateral takes us to spinosum. What parts, okay, take your tongue, stick it up in the roof of your mouth, feel the hard part, that's called the hard palate. Move your tongue posteriorly till it becomes soft, that's called the soft palate. So the hard palate is bony, the soft palate is not bony. So regarding the hard palate, what part of what bones form the posterior aspect of the roof of the mouth? Are you naming these things?
Yes.
Okay, what are they?
Palatine bone.
Am I hearing horizontal plates of the palatine bones? What part of what bone forms the anterior aspect of the roof of the mouth? So are you naming now these?
Palatine process.
Palatine processes of the maxilla. You've all heard the term temple. It's a lay term. Put your finger on your temple if you need to, or just use the picture. What part of what bone is associated with what lay people call the temple? Let's just name the bone to start with. Sphenoid bone, okay. Now what part of the sphenoid bone is that? Greater wing. It's the lateral aspect of the greater wing. or the external aspect of the greater wing. The internal aspect of the greater wing would be here. So you're really touching the lateral or external aspect of that when you put your fingers right there. So what do you suppose happens to a professional fighter? I don't care, boxer, mixed martial arts is probably worse because they don't wear gloves, or at least they don't think they wear gloves. What do you suppose happens to a fighter when they get pounded in the side of the head 1,000 times over the course of a few years? Can't be good. You've all held, well, probably all held a skull in your hands. The Monday lab certainly has. The Wednesday lab will today. Is the skull meant to be pounded on? Having held one in your hands? Having looked in the nasal cavity at the bones right here that form the septum? Man, those are kind of fragile. How about the nasal bones? How about the frontal processes of the maxilla? Man, that's some fragile stuff. Start swinging baseball bats at people's faces like you see on television. Crazy, crazy stuff. All right, so letters B and C, once again, skull versus face. They're on the list for, I guess, two reasons. One is the mandible a skull bone or a facial bone? Are the temporal bones skull bones or facial bones? The other reason, you need to be able to close your eyes and picture these bones. What bone is this? How many of them do you have? One. How many did you have?
Two.
When you have bones that fuse completely, what you have is a synostosis. You have several synostoses in your body. How many mandibles do you see here? Oh, okay, one. But how many parts to the mandible do you see? Two. Versus if you go back to the colored textbook pictures, you have one mandible. So you have instances in your body where parts of bones or two different bones fuse and form a synostosis. So we see synostoses with the frontal bones. We see synostoses with the mandible. We saw a synostosis on Monday when the epiphyseal, what am I talking about? You get finally complete ossification at the growth plate. The epiphyseal plate becomes the epiphyseal line. I mean, if we take one of our femurs, there's no hyaline cartilage there. It's completely ossified. There are some other synostoses that I want you to be aware of, and I don't want to call them abnormal, but I'll call them undesirable. So if you live long enough, and there's no magic number, like I remember somebody told me blue spruce trees don't really turn blue until their 100th birthday. So I went out and camped under a blue spruce tree the night of its 100th birthday and expected to go to bed and it'd be green and wake up and it was blue. That's ridiculous. But if you live long enough, your costal cartilage will ossify. Imagine that. How's that going to affect breathing? If you live long enough, your intervertebral disc will ossify. How's that going to affect flexibility? So T1 and T2 or L1 and L2, whatever two vertebrae you want to pick, if that intervertebral disc between them ossifies, you no longer have a vertebra, a fibrocartilage pad, a vertebra. You have a solid bony mass there. The entire lumbar region could ossify. So again, I don't want to call these things abnormal. They're undesirable, but they happen in very, very old people, and there's no absolute number. We can't say 89, 92, or, oh, you got to live to be at least 110. They just happen sometimes in very old people. So that's what we're seeing, and that really comes up, and the point of bringing that up comes up right here when we were talking about ossification, and now we're talking about bones of the skull versus bones of the face, and we're talking about how many of a bone someone has. So if you look back at your list that we're exploring, special topics, look at letter J, paired versus single. So which of the following is not a paired bone? Lacrimal, maxilla, inferior nasal concha, vomer, ethmoid. Which of those are not paired bones? Vomer's not paired. You have two lacrimals. You have two lacrimals, you have two nasals, you have two maxilla. Ethmoid. The ethmoid is a single bone, and the vomer is a single bone. How many frontal bones do you have? One. How many mandibles do you have? How many maxilla do you have?
Two.
I don't think it's difficult. I think you just deserve to have me point out to you that I expect you to be able to respond to those types of questions. And that's what this list is all about. Again, it's evolved over the years where I just assumed people would know that type of thing, given a bone chart and buying books with pictures and a lab filled with materials to study hands-on. And too often somebody said, I didn't know we'd have to know that. And so I said, okay, next semester I'll point this out to the students. Letter D, the hyoid bone. What does the hyoid bone articulate? What bone does the hyoid bone articulate with? It doesn't. It doesn't. Is it anchored? Is it held in place by something?
Yeah.
Yes? No? Ligaments? Do those ligaments have a name? What are the names of those ligaments? Have you guys read your owner's manual? Or did you just say, I've had microwaves before, I'll figure it out. All I want to do is heat a cup of coffee, and I'll always use high. I don't care to learn how to use 80% power or 70% power, or tell it I'm defrosting chicken versus beef. Most people never read their owner's manual, do they? We've had that discussion. We had that discussion day one. Let's look at our owner's manual. And let's see what it says about the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone attaches via the stylohyoid ligaments to the styloid processes of the temporal bone. The supra and infrahyoid muscles pull the hyoid bone dorsally when a person swallows. This aids in swallowing. So do I expect you to know that?
Yes.
I do. Guys, I'm not trying to be a jerk, okay? I give you my word as a gentleman. What I'm doing right now is I'm telling you stuff that I assume you know, because I've given it to you. Here, Natalie, take it.
Okay.
Now, why wouldn't you know it? And I know you will. You're a great student, and most of you are. But too often, people miss questions, and I'm flabbergasted. I'm blown away. Why were there F's on the histology practical? Blows my mind. Literally, it blows me away. So yes, guys, you're expected to know this, okay? You know why this is in the bone chart? Because somebody missed the question on the practical. I put this type of skull on the practical. And this is on your practical, I promise. It's question 6. No, I don't know what number it is, but it's on your practical. Name the indicated structures. Yeah, what attaches to the indicated structures? The stylohyoid ligaments. Anchor the okay? So yeah, man, I do expect you to know that, okay? And that's one of, I guess, several thousand things I expect you to know. Letter E, orbital fossa. Now, if you were in the lab on Monday, I know you're good with this because Molly wrote it on the board. I think she even gave you an acronym, did she? You have some stupid little acronym? And I say stupid just because I don't personally like mnemonics and things. I'd rather just remember it. But, so how many bones form the orbital fossa? 7, okay? So be able to name them. And for the most part, you know, what part of the bone formed? The maxilla is one of the 7. What part of the maxilla is this? That's the frontal process. Now, this is the lacrimal bone, and this is not a part of the lacrimal bone that you have to know the name of, so I wouldn't ask you what part of the lacrimal bone. On the other hand, with the ethmoid bone, this is a part of the ethmoid bone that you have to know the name of, so instead of just expecting you to know that the ethmoid bone is one of the 7, I would expect you to know what part of the ethmoid bone. What part of the ethmoid bone is that? Just look at the notes you wrote down in the lab on Monday. Molly wrote it on the board. How about the yellow one? What bone is that? Hint. The one of the 7 that's really, really hard to see. The one of the 7 that in the lab, if you're looking in the skull, you won't even see it. It's the palatine bone. What part of the palatine bone is that? Orbital process. All right, letter F, nose. So, we'll just start with this. So what would you say? Well, your friend says, "God, I broke my nose." And you say, "Ooh, that must have hurt. What part of your nose did you break?" They say, "The bridge of my nose." So what bone or bones are broken? Nasal bones. Okay. Now let's move laterally. I broke the lateral framework of my nose. What part of what bone did they break? Frontal process of the maxilla. I broke something, like your friend would really say this, but I broke something posterior to the frontal process of the maxilla. What bone did they break? The lacrimal bone. I broke the nasal septum. Okay, if they broke the vomer, they broke the inferior part of the nasal septum. I broke the superior aspect of my nasal septum. Your accounting friend tells you that. What did they break? Don't look. It's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. I broke, the doctor said it was some weird little bone on the internal part of my nasal cavity. They broke their inferior nasal concha. Guys, I'm begging you to use your owner's manual because I actually went to great lengths to write this stuff down for you. I don't know where it is, but we'll find it. Bones of the nasal cavity. So the roof is There's the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The floor is the hard palate. Let's go back to the pictures for a minute. So the roof is here. The floor is here. So if we wanted to look at the roof, we'd have to look in the floor of the cranial vault. So we'd be looking at this. That's like somebody standing above all of this looking down. And of course I'm pretty sure you're learning your foramen, you know that these are cribriform or olfactory foramen, the little holes. The thing in the middle, of course, is the crista galli. The horizontal part is the cribriform plate. And the little holes are the cribriform foramen or olfactory foramen, and they're the passageways for the olfactory nerves. So receptors for smell, which are in your nose, their processes go up through the little holes and conduct that signal to the brain, something that we'll build on next semester. But so for now, roof of the nasal cavity, cribriform plate. Floor of the nasal cavity. Now think about this. Isn't the ceiling in this room the same as the floor in the room above us? I mean, I know there's a bunch of pipes and insulation and crap up there, but literally, if you have a 2-story house, isn't the floor of the upstairs the roof of the downstairs? So whatever's the roof of the mouth is the floor of the nasal cavity. So that's the hard palate. If we wanted to see the hard palate, so now we're looking at the inferior aspect of the hard palate, which is the roof of the oral cavity. If we look at the superior aspect of the hard palate, we'd be looking at the floor of the nasal cavity. And this came up in some other context a little while ago. You have the palatine processes of the maxilla. You have the horizontal plates of the palatine bones. So those are the 4 bones and respective parts that form the roof of the mouth. What else is there of interest right here? Well, there's a hole. What's that hole called? Anybody? Incisive foramen. And the incisive foramen is the passageway 4. Anybody want to look at the chart on Facebook? The what? The what? Not nasopalatine nerve, exactly. The nasopalatine nerve. Remember, there's a whole chart or a nerve chart on Facebook. You don't have to dig this stuff out of the book. All you gotta do is print it off. So we're talking about the nasal cavity. Roof is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid. Floor is the hard palate. I think the rest of this we talked about. Bridge, nasal bones, lateral framework, frontal processes of maxilla, lacrimal bones, the internal walls, the inferior nasal concha, the septum, perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and the vomer. Let's examine that in detail. Hint. So we'll go back to a picture that we've looked at. Nasal septum. I have a deviated septum. The doctor's going to break my nose to fix my deviated septum. The superior part of the septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. The inferior part is the vomer. Now if we take a sagittal skull and look at it, we can get a better feel for how those bones come together to form the septum. So here's the ethmoid bone. There's the crista galli sticking up. There's the perpendicular plate sticking down. In blue, there's the ethmoid bone. Notice that the superior part of the vomer bone articulates with the body of the sphenoid bone posteriorly, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone anteriorly. Anterior to that would just be cartilage. The inferior aspect of the vomer bone articulates with the hard palate. The anterior inferior aspect is articulating with the frontal processes of the maxilla. The inferior posterior part is articulating with the horizontal plates of the palatal. Man, that's a lot of stuff, guys. That's a lot of stuff. Check this out, man. You're gonna love me or hate me. Vomer bone. Inferior aspect articulates with the palatine processes of the maxilla anteriorly, the horizontal plates of the palatine bones posteriorly. Superior aspect articulates with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone anteriorly, and the inferior aspect of the body of the sphenoid bone posteriorly. I'd probably have that where I could read it while I was looking at this picture. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Come on, man, I'm telling you exactly what I expect you to know, okay? It's a lot, yeah. But wouldn't it be worse if I didn't tell you? I just figured out. There's only 430 muscles in the book, just learn them all. Instead, what do? I give you a definitive list of how many. A mere 65 out of 430 in the book. 430 in the book out of how many in the body? Over 600. Guys, I'm giving it to you. Please do it.
So go back to your deviated septum. So what exactly does that mean?
I'll tell you. Since you brought that up, there's something else I meant to tell you a minute ago and forgot to. So, of course, this is a diagram, okay? So, this person's septum is a perfect straight line. Nobody's is a perfect straight line. So, deviated septum, there's some deviation there. So, this left nostril would be narrower than the right nostril if the septum was deviated. Everybody has a deviated septum to some degree. Is the deviation significant enough to really impair your breathing? Well, then you might have it fixed surgically. Let's glance at a picture or two, and we might be able to pick up a deviation. So let's try here. Now, first of all, this is a plastic model, so just like a diagram, it's going to be perfect. I had one in here of an actual, that was not deviated, it's just broken. Doesn't look like I have a photograph of a real skull. But there are 3 real skulls in the lab. I want to take a look at those. The other thing that I meant to point out a minute ago, when we were looking at this picture, and I asked you about the, what did I say this is called? Incisive foramen. And somebody out here told us this is the passageway for the nasopalatine nerve. This suture is the median suture. That's the suture that doesn't form in the cleft palate. So the roof of the mouth is open. If we go back to the nose, the septum, we looked at it this way. Looked at it this way, and I attempted to encourage you to tie that lateral picture in with all of this. This is a disarticulated vomer bone. So where are you going to find this in the lab? The black box. Remember, there's black boxes in there. There are 3 of them. Lacrimal bones, nasal bones, etc. And if you check out the bone chart, nasal bone doesn't say anything. So I'm not going to ask you any surface features on the nasal bone. What am I going to ask you? Name this bone. I'm not going to ask you left versus right nasal bone because it doesn't say R versus L. The way the parietal and temporal say R versus L. Okay? It is an owner's manual, people. Lacrimal bone. I'm not going to ask you right versus left, but there is one surface feature on your bone chart, so I might ask you that. All right, vomer bone. I give you all this information here. So you're going to pull one of these out of the black box. And what bone or bones might you have in your hands when you have this? Going to refer to this. So if the vomer bone articulates with the, okay, so those are the bones you're going to have in your hands, and it's going to be like puzzle pieces. You're going to put them together. So this is the superior part of the vomer bone, and the thing that makes it super easy to get your handle, wrap your head around, and it's easier in your hand than it is in a picture. This part back here has some width. We look down on the top. This part has some width, and that's where the body of the sphenoid bone sits. So you're going to hold this in your hand, and you're going to place the sphenoid bone on top of it. And the body of the sphenoid bone is going to sit right there. So you do that with the picture, with the text that I wrote down in your bone chart, and then you'll really get a handle on it. So this part of the vomer, and I don't care if you guys want to take a picture of this, go right ahead. I see you photographing a lot of things in this room. This is what the ethmoid bone articulates with. This is what the body of the sphenoid bone articulates with.
So that's the posterior aspect?
Yeah, this is posterior, Theodore. Yeah, this is anterior. And so the cartilage would be in here. What part, I said ethmoid, but I intentionally didn't give you the part. What part of the ethmoid bone articulates right here?
Perpendicular plate.
Yeah, perpendicular plate. So let's go back here. See, there's that flat part that the body of the sphenoid bone sits on. There's the perpendicular plate. Now, the thing where you have to be careful here is now posterior's on your left. In this other picture, posterior's on your right. Right, well, I guess I beat that to death. This is just another picture of this. Oh, yeah, I liked this one because now you can see how that posterior superior part has width. You can sort of start to visualize how the body of the sphenoid bone would sit in that. All right, orbital fossa nose. Letter G, palate. We looked at the palate a couple of times. We've seen that the hard palate, at least, is the floor of the nasal cavity and the roof of the oral cavity. I pointed out that the hard part of the palate, if you use your tongue, the hard part of the palate is the hard palate. Posterior to the hard palate is the soft palate. And again, we've looked at this already, but it comes up, see, specifically as a line item there in your notes. So you have the palatine processes of the maxilla, the horizontal plates of the palatine bones, the horizontal suture, the median suture, which doesn't close and cleft palate, the incisive foramen, passageway for the nasopalatine nerve. Letter H, sinuses. The sinus is a cavity. Sinuses we talk about this semester are air sinuses. Next semester we'll have dural sinuses. Very, very different, but they're still cavities. So you have four paranasal air sinuses. Or, if we include right and left, you actually have five. So you have a frontal sinus. Look at your bone chart under ethmoid bone, you'll see an ethmoid sinus. Look at your bone chart under sphenoid bone, you'll see a sphenoid sinus. So frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid. The fourth, or the fourth and fifth if we're including left and right, are the maxillary sinuses. It's the maxillary sinuses that we typically feel in terms of like having a cold or any sort of I'm congested. The worst, the nastiest, and some of you probably had it, some of you probably never have. I've had it once or twice, but an honest to God sinus infection where the maxillary sinus is just filled with crap and the pressure is horrendous, and you know you actually have true sinusitis because, has anybody had this? Your freaking teeth hurt. The pressure in here is so great, your teeth hurt. It's a horrible, horrible in terms of, can't breathe, congestion, headache. Doctor, my face, the doctor's like, does that hurt? Ah! Stuff's coming out of your nose. And anyway, so you've got four, or if we include right and left, sinuses that are very easy to see in the lab. There's one, and I pointed this out to the Monday group, I'll point it out to the Wednesday group today. The frontal sinus, we probably have a single thing in the lab where you can see the frontal sinus, and that's because of its location. We have a sagittal skull in the lab, and it shows quite well the frontal sinus. That's probably the only thing we have in the lab to show the frontal sinus.
What's the purpose?
The sinuses is kind of crazy. You'll actually read to lighten the skull. You'll read issues with humidifying and moisturizing the air. You'll read issues with affecting the tone of our speech. So, I know. Look it up.
I'll get back to you.
You get back to me. Why do we have incisors? We don't tear meat off the bone, we use silverware. And then somebody says, well, I like fried chicken or baked chicken on the bone. Oh, okay. I'm so weird. I cut my chicken off the bone. Last night I had the strangest craving. Fried chicken. I went to King Super and I said, I want the 8-piece of Chipotle fried chicken. And the guy's digging around the chicken, looking for pepper. And he said, I'm sorry, sir. I'm all out of legs. Assuming that drumsticks. What I can do, I can give you 2 legs out of the non-Chipotle, and I can put the Chipotle seasoning on them. There's no difference in the batter. The Chipotle seasoning is a powder we sprinkle on them. I said, that'll be fine. Digging around the chicken. I said, I'm sorry, sir. I'm all out of the regular legs too. I can offer you 2 pieces of anything you want. And, so it's an 8 piece. I said, well, the point of it was my wife likes the dark meat, so I said, just give me 2 thighs. And so he's digging around, and he said, I don't seem to have any thigh. He said, let me go in the back and see if there are any drumsticks or legs, I think he called them, or thighs coming out. I'm sorry, sir, there are no drumsticks. And he said, oh, let me look in the non-Chipotle for the thighs. And so he finds 2 thighs in the non-Chipotle. So now I have my 8-piece of chicken, but instead of 2 breasts, 2 wings, 2 legs, and 2 thighs, it's 2 breasts, 2 wings, and 4 thighs. And the 2 of the thighs were Chipotle and 2 were not. And it said, oh, you were going to put the Chipotle seasoning on those thighs. Oh, yes, yeah, so he did. Anyway, so I get home, and I have the 8 pieces that I was expecting, even though there was 4 thighs instead of 2 thighs and 2 legs. But the only pieces that were the Chipotle were the 2 that he put it on. The other 6 were the raw ones to begin. I was so mad. I almost got in the car and drove over there and raised hell. So, Dr. N used to do things like that. She called it giving our brains time to process. She'd just stop and tell some stupid little story. And then she put it on the exam too. It was a crazy thing. She also ate gummy bears while she lectured, and she smoked while she lectured. So it was very interesting. You didn't sit on the front row, because as she talked and ate gummy bears, the particles came out of her mouth. And of course the cigarette smoke. All right, letter I, the vertebral column. Pictures for this. So it says curves of the vertebral column. You might recognize this from the DVD. So you have 4 curves, and a couple of them you're born with. So they're called primary curvatures. A couple of the curvatures develop after you're born, and so they're called secondary curvatures. So, think about what types of activities would cause the cervical curvature to form. I know you don't necessarily all have children, but you've probably seen a child somewhere. You have some concept of babies, and one of the first things a little baby will do when basically they can't do much of anything, you can put them down and come back tomorrow and they're still there. So it's safe to leave them while you go snowboarding for the weekend, because all they can do is raise their head. They raise their head and they drop it. They raise their head and they drop it. You stand there videotaping, laughing, how they're smashing their little face in the pillow. they're developing the cervical curvature as that is happening. They reach a point where they have head control. That's somewhere, but generally 6 months if you want a number, 4 to 8 months if you want a range. It's awesome when they develop head control because now you can put them in the little backpacks. You can take them snow skiing, you can take them hiking, you can take them biking, whatever you want to do with them. And they have head control. Lumbar curvature, well, they start crawling. They reach a point where they can sit up. They begin, trying to walk, that type of thing. So just think about activities that would lead to the development of those two curvatures. As far as number of vertebrae, types of vertebrae, number of each type of vertebrae, you have 7 cervical, and you know that insofar as C1 and C2, because this came up on Monday, they actually have a name, Atlas and Axis. The others we just call C3, C4, whatever. Thoracic, you have 12. These are the ones associated with the ribs. An interesting joint to name. I know we spent some time naming joints last Wednesday and again on Monday in the context of looking at heads, condyles, facets, all of that. These joints are called costovertebral joints. And I know on the DVD I point out specifically that the head of the rib articulates with the body of the vertebra, and the neck of the rib, which is also known as a tubercle, articulates with the transverse process of the vertebra, and actually hold a rib and a vertebra up there. You've all seen that in the DVD. Lumbar, we have 5. And then pelvic, which some people are going to call sacral. We've got 5 fused. 5 fused sacral vertebrae, which constitute the sacrum. And we have 3 to 5 fused, which constitute the coccyx. Interestingly, the variation here in your coccygeal vertebrae has to do literally with where your tail broke off. I know that sounds a little crazy, but it's true. You did have a tail. So we looked at this on Monday as well in another context. So your sacrum, okay, one word, sacrum, composed of 5 fused sacral vertebrae. Sacrum, composed of 5 fused sacral vertebrae. Your coccyx, composed of 3 to 5 fused coccygeal vertebrae. You had many, many coccygeal vertebrae embryologically, and your tail did break off. The tail of your dog, the tail of your cat is made up of coccygeal vertebrae. An animal like a dog or a cat, their tail doesn't break off. And I guess in some cases, I can't even think of an example, you probably can. In some cases, we have it cut off because we don't think that breed is supposed to have a tail. Never understood that. But anyway, my Labrador has her tail and she's quite fond of it. Some people have 2 coccygeal vertebrae, some have 6. Most people have 3, 4, or 5. What is the dog breed we chop their tail on?
Dobermans.
Dobermans. Do you put them to sleep, or do you just do it with shears when they're babies?
Shears when they're babies.
Shear, kind of like circumcision. You don't anesthetize a penis, you just remove the foreskin. They say the anesthesia would be more painful than the circumcision, so who knows? All right, curves, number of vertebrae, types of vertebrae, number of each type. So we've got all that. General characteristics, specific characteristics. I give you that in great detail right here. Let me just point it out. So your general characteristics are what I call the typical features. And then after that, I get into these are features that a cervical would have versus these are features that a thoracic would have. And you absolutely do not have to recognize T1 versus T2 versus T3 versus T4. That's a whole other world of stuff. The only specifics you would have would be, I'm sure you can guess, there are two of them named atlas and the axis. Other than that, is this cervical versus thoracic versus lumbar. The cervical have the transverse foramen and the transverse processes, which are the passageways for the vertebral arteries. They have the forked or bifurcated spinous process. The thoracic have the articular sites for the ribs, and the slender spinous processes. The lumbar have the big body on the sort of square spine. So again, I'm giving you all of that, just make sure you read it. All right, finally, letter J, paired versus single. I pointed that out because it came up earlier, so out of order, but I pointed that out. And then letter K, right versus left. You know, if your bone chart says R/L, be prepared to answer right versus left. Let's look at one more picture. Hint, hint, hint. So we talked about this on Monday, but I don't think I showed the picture. So we're looking at a left zygomatic bone. And I said we talked about this on Monday. That was in the context of processes. There's a nomenclature for the processes. And I know that all of these processes are not on your bone chart, but we went over them on Monday, and so I'm sure it's clear that you're expected to know them. Remember, for example, this is called your turn. Frontal process of the zygomatic bone versus the
Zygomatic process.
Now this one is on your bone chart.
Zygomatic
Temporal process of the zygomatic versus those two are on your bone chart. Speaking of your bone chart, what's formed when you combine these two? A plus B equals C.
The zygomatic
arch. And then this was another one that we looked at on Monday in terms of naming processes. It'd be the maxillary process of the zygomatic. But so then we talked about, how are you going to figure out left and right and which process is which when they're disarticulated? Well, the temporal process is the wider one. And that was just a recommendation of what I suggested on Monday that you use. And of course, in the lab, when you've got it in your hand, you may jot down something that's more helpful to you. And then the one that sticks up, of course, is the frontal process. So the actual widest one is this one. That corresponds to that. So that's the maxillary process. The long, slender one is the frontal. And then the other one, just sort of by default, is the temporal. So, do be prepared to take the zygomatic, and you are allowed to pick the bones up during the practical, but do be prepared to, pick a bone like this up, and maybe it has a little piece of red tape, here or here, and, name the bone, state whether it's left or right, name the indicated part of the bone, okay? So absolutely be prepared to do that type of thing. Questions? We'll cover the disorders on Monday. We're on page 24. They're kind of fascinating.